Well, good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon plenary. Hopefully everybody had a good lunch. It sounds by the volume of the conversation, at least, you all have been engaged in some excellent conversation. Hopefully that is one of the big takeaways from a conference like this, is a lot of hybridization of thought and exploring some new topics. So we're happy to be a part of that. My name is Jonah Fogel. I'm the program manager for the Environmental Resilience Institute. We're very happy to be with you today, and I'm very happy to be able to play a role in sponsoring a conversation among these four folks up here on the stage, but moreover, having them have a conversation with you all. So this will be a very interactive session, very little in terms of presentation. And so we've got a couple of microphones that are going to be floating around the room. I'm not sure where Sydney went, but you'll see a nice lady. I think she's in a blue outfit. She'll be walking around with microphones in just a bit, helping you connect with our panel and thinking about the topic on hand, which is the interdependencies between urban and rural communities. Sort of thinking about the conference as a topic, right? We have the overarching theme is this bridge between these two types of geography, but we haven't really defined terms very, very closely yet. So we've taken it as sort of an article of faith that you know what it means to have an interdependency, and that it has something to do with sustainability and with resilience. But this afternoon's presentation and conversation is really about exploring those topics, trying to find some consensus about the implications of having interdependencies. So when I agreed to facilitate this conversation, I said, we really need to do that. We need to explore these things because right now we have two siloed agendas in a way. We have this idea that rural communities have a lot to offer, that there's a lot of exciting stuff going on out there, going back decades and decades, and lots of you in the room today have had lots of interaction with those topics, whether it be food systems or sustainable energy like solar or wind, thinking about soil sequestration as a possible future economic opportunity for people, how we intersect with our planning exercises at the local level, whether it be transportation design, urban design for building construction and the codes that go therein into that enterprise. Some of that echoes with the urban context, right? But they have some specific challenges out there in the rural areas. We don't necessarily think of these two geographies as being shoulder to shoulder. And we certainly don't think of them as being in the same conversation often. Urban communities have a lot more people. There's a lot more organizations working on a whole lot more projects just by sheer volume. And that means that there's a lot of activity and a lot of resources being paid to urban areas in a way that's different than rural areas. So we're going to try to digest a little bit of those things that we've taken as a given, and explore how these areas can get at this idea of interdependency. So the foundational concept in interdependency is mutuality, right? It's not enough to be able to say that it exists. We have to be able to point at it and bolster it when it's not sufficient. Inside the concept of mutuality, we have some big ideas, which is something like the idea of we the people. Urban people, rural people in this country belong to the same populace. They're certainly dependent on each other's things like sources of energy, transportation corridors, which cut across these things. But we don't necessarily politically see ourselves as being similar in some circumstances. And in many cases, there's an animosity that underlies some of those relationships, which I think we'll get at as well. The strategies and the types of tools that are being employed in urban and rural areas are different. In the sort of rural areas, it's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. And in the urban areas, there's some global threats like coastal adaptation and resilience, and where do you put the next seawall, and how are you going to make enough houses to put everybody that's coming into your community. So I offer all of that as a point of introduction, but these are the real experts, and these are the guys who are going to help us find our way through this conversation. I don't know if we'll find many answers, along the way, but hopefully it'll open up some new questions for us to explore. So I'll try to go here from my left, your left also, and work our way down the panel here by means of introduction. So the first person here in this nice, lovely colored, brown-colored jacket is Hamilton Lombard. If you couldn't guess by the way he's dressed, he's a demographer at the Weldon Cooper Center. That's a little unfair. I'm sorry, Hamilton. He's a demographer with the Weldon Cooper Center. Weldon Cooper Center, if you're not familiar with them, is based here at UVA. And they offer the population estimates and projections for the General Assembly. So you may have been paying attention to the conversation at the federal level about the census and how to make counts happen. Hamilton and the folks over at Weldon Cooper are the ones who translate the sheer numbers of the census into some meaningful takeaways, and also help calculate some of the implications for that programmatically and budgetarily. Hamilton also publishes very often on statchat.org, which is a great resource for being able to understand sort of the messaging behind demography in the state. And so I invite you to check out that blog. To Hamilton's left is Anthony Flacavento. He is an economic development consultant and organic farmer out of Abingdon, Virginia. I know Anthony from many years ago in the work that we did with community food systems, and always saw him as a paragon of thought and how to think about revitalizing the entrepreneurial spirit and resource farmers to do business at scale, which is something that is always a challenge. He's an author. He's got some books out on a table just outside this room if you'd like to take a look or even buy them, if you're up for it. One is called Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up, Harnessing Real-World Experience for Transformative Change. And another one out of a few years ago is Healthy Food Systems, a toolkit for building value chains, which I think is an interesting read all by itself. Moving on from there, we have Amy Thompson. She is an AICP LEED certified planner with Perkins and Will. Amy has many years, 20 years of experience with master planning, urban regeneration, rural resilience, and climate adaptation planning. So we're looking forward to hearing from Amy especially. And then to her colleague, just to her left, is John Pendorf, who is an architect. And has about as many years of experience on everything from interior renovations, new construction, thinking about things from energy perspective, but also utility, how we actually think about the spaces that we use. He's also a featured author in such places as the Washington Post, the Washington Business Journal, Urban Land Magazine, and even National Geographic Online. So these are folks who come with a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm going to turn things over now to Hamilton Lombard to give us a bit of a background, if you will, on sort of the stats of Virginia's demography.
One small correction, if you want to look up our web series, it's statchatva.org. I'd welcome you to go on there, and it's worth subscribing to. So given our session topic is on the interdependence between Virginia's rural and urban areas, I'm going to go over a couple of the main demographic trends we've seen in Virginia, and they might provide a little context to our discussion. The most obvious trend in Virginia so far this decade is that we're growing a good deal less than we have in the past. Over the last 5 years, Virginia's population has grown by 3%. That's slower than the U.S., and that's the slowest rate Virginia's experienced in about 100 years. As population growth has slowed, what growth we've had has been increasingly concentrated in a few of its urban areas. Northern Virginia has made up about 2/3 of all Virginia's population growth since 2010. Outside Virginia's largest metro areas, population declines have become a lot more common, particularly in rural areas. In the majority of Virginia's 95 counties, most have lost population since 2010. These trends are a bit of a change from what we saw in previous decades. In the 2000s, Virginia was growing considerably faster than the U.S. Less than a quarter of its counties were losing population. If you go back all the way probably to World War II, Virginia consistently outpaced the U.S. in population growth. In the 3 decades after World War II, we grew just as fast as Texas did. And I think Fairfax County is one example of this. Their public school enrollment was 12,000 students in 1945. Over the next 25 years, the school division added 6,000 students every single year. And if you go across Virginia, you saw similar growth rates. Roanoke County's population grew by 50% just during the 1950s. Henrico grew by 100% during the same decade, and Newport News grew by 170% during the 50s. At the same time, many of Virginia's cities were being hollowed out as residents left for the suburbs. And if you went outside Virginia's metro areas, rural areas weren't growing quickly, but they were mostly growing. Given how much growth we had in the past and how it suddenly stopped, it is worth asking the question, why? One answer is that Virginia's population isn't growing slower everywhere. Virginia's independent cities are generally growing more quickly than they have in decades. And also, rather than shedding population, cities are absorbing a lot of the region's populations, which means there's less growth left over for neighboring counties. But the main reason Virginia is growing more slowly is that its population is aging, as is the U.S. population. Virginia's age structure has enormous impact on how the population grows. The simplest and crudest way to explain how this works is, as someone gets older, the odds of reproduction start to go down, and the odds of dying go up. And Virginia's getting older, so if you look at the last 10 years, the number of births are down 7%, the number of deaths are up 17%. Because rural areas have an older age structure, deaths outnumber births in nearly every rural county in Virginia. Most are declining if they haven't been able to attract enough people moving in to make up for the deaths. Once a community's age structure becomes unbalanced, it can take a long time for it to rebalance. Several years ago, I attended a multi-day conference down on the Dickinson-Buchanan County border. The goal of the conference was for community members to lay out in writing what impact they believed the Coalfield Expressway would have on the region once it was completed. A couple hours into the conference, I realized that I think the reason I'd been invited is they needed somebody who'd be kind of a Debbie Downer and kind of curb everybody's enthusiasm a little bit. I tried to explain that if the Coalfield Expressway had been built in 1980 and it had managed to stop people moving out, the region's population would have grown. But in 1980, the Coalfield region had twice as many people in their 20s as over 65. Since then, decades of young adults moving out and a number of retirees moving into the region meant that the counties now had twice as many people over 65 than in their 20s. As a result, deaths now far outnumber births in the region. For the Coalfield region to grow today, out-migration would not only need to stop, but the birth rate would need to double and remain elevated for decades, just to compensate for population loss from its aging residents. By the end of the conference, I felt somewhat successful. I think community members admitted that population growth was probably too much to expect from the highway. Earlier this month, my office released population projections for Virginia and its counties and cities that provide an idea how Virginia's population will change in coming decades. The projections show that Virginia's population will continue to slow as the Commonwealth ages. By 2030, Virginia's population over 65 is expected to be about double what it was in 2010. Outside of Northern Virginia, 85% of population growth is predicted to come from those 65 and older. The age structures in more counties are going to look like the Coalfields. Goochland County is expected to continue to grow as Richmond suburbs spill over its borders. But by 2030, Goochland is projected to also have 3.5 times more residents over 65 than in their 20s. As a closing point, I'd say if this sounds a bit gloomy, I don't think it should. If you look across the U.S., you look across Virginia, counties with large retired populations, as Jonah mentioned, have high successful business startup rates. They're higher than urban areas. And you see this affecting the labor force as well. As more people retire, employers have to invest in productivity to increase their production, to keep customers, but they also have to pay their employees more, either to keep them or attract them. Since 2010, if you look across Virginia, rural counties have seen household incomes grow 12%. Virginia's urban areas have seen a 5% income growth. And that generally seems to correlate with counties that are aging have seen the largest income gains. Older counties have also seen some of the largest declines in poverty over the last couple decades. All that said, I think adjusting to having a much larger population over 65 is going to take some adaptation, particularly when that growth in 65 plus population is going to be concentrated in specific counties. Others may not age nearly as much. But I don't think the changes that we're likely to see are going to be anything like what Virginia dealt with in the post-war decades. I think there's going to probably be more room for local governments to adapt, and I hope probably more time to focus on making Virginia more resilient.
Hi, I'm Amy Thompson. I'm an urban planner at Perkins and Will. I'm going to talk quickly and just give a quick overview of the climate adaptation plan that John and I and the rest of our team worked on for Washington, D.C. And just a quick, Perkins and Will is a architecture firm. We have a table out in the front if anyone wants to learn more about our architecture practice, our resilience practice, and some of the work that we're doing here in Charlottesville. So to quickly talk about the DC Climate Adaptation Plan, Perkins and Will and our team was hired by the DC Department of Energy and the Environment to create this climate adaptation plan. As I think a good reference, the funding for the project actually came from the plastic bag tax. This was that DC has implemented, so this was one of the projects that has come out of that funding. So in order to get a really good idea of DC before we came up with an adaptation plan, we had to kind of look at both the climate projections for DC and then also at the vulnerability and different populations and areas of the city that were actually vulnerable to the climate change. So in order to do this, we had 3 tasks and 3 reports. They were the climate projections, which were completed by Kleinfelder, and we also had the climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe on our team in order to really take a look at both the National Climate Assessment, which DC sort of sits in the middle of the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, so we downscaled to find more focused climate projections for DC, and that was our first report. Then the second report was the vulnerability assessment, which took a look at the city's population, and tried to really look at how the overlapping groups that were very vulnerable due to lack of education and poverty, not great housing stock, and how that also overlapped with some of the flooding and other vulnerabilities that we saw based on climate. And then the third was the actual adaptation plan, which came up with recommendations for the city and assigned city agencies to be both in charge and then a sub-agency that was going to be in charge of all the different recommendations. So here's a quick look at the climate projections. Pretty easy. We're looking at sea level rise, higher precipitation, and higher temperatures, sort of the standard that everyone can see. And this map here actually shows, this is the Potomac River and the Anacostia, but at a larger scale, 100-year flood level. These are hard to see. We don't expect you guys to be able to read all of this, but we took everything at 3 scenarios, 2020, which was today, 2050, and 2080, and looked at the projections for the weather in order to kind of plan immediate, middle range, and long range changes that the city would have to make. And then the vulnerability assessment, we sort of laid over key elements such as energy, transportation, water, and different municipal resources, and then kind of looked at the population and how the population overlapped with some of these vulnerable elements of the city infrastructure in order for the city to kind of be able to focus in. And then finally, the adaptation plan, the recommendations that we gave to the city, we broke into transportation and utilities, buildings and development, neighborhoods and community, and then governments and implementation. And we thought breaking this down for people into these different categories kind of made it easier to understand. We wanted this to be not only digestible for the community, but we wanted this to be broken down in a way that city agencies, when they put their budgets together, they could more easily take these actions and make them into budget items, because, you know, if you can't have something funded, no matter how good of an adaptation it is, it's not really going to help. So again, we don't expect anyone to be able to read these, but we took the actions, we categorized them, we gave some sub-actions to them, and we tied those actions to a climate risk, and then also had the supporting agencies. Some of the agencies like WMATA, our transportation authority in DC, crosses lines over into Virginia or Maryland, but you still have to engage the regional folks even though it is a city plan. And then now John is going to talk about where we are 2 years into the plan.
The plan was released to the public officially in 2017. Before that, there was a fair amount of community engagement to make sure people understood why we were issuing this plan. The city held a series of town hall meetings. There was an online forum where you could post questions and comments. So there was a little bit of community engagement before this was released to the public. But we wanted to touch on where the city has gone since this plan has been issued, because the last thing that the DC Department of Energy and Environment wanted was this to just be put on a shelf somewhere. So we have seen increased interagency coordination. This has come in a couple of different realms in our comprehensive plan revamp. There's a comprehensive energy plan that's currently underway as well. And these are being, some of these are primarily funded by a single agency, but we're seeing other agencies work with them. There's also revamps to the building codes. There's an equity advisory group. The mayor has formed a resilience cabinet that meets, I believe, on a monthly basis. And the city is in the process of actually developing resilience guidelines for different typologies of buildings in the city. If you download the full report, which you can do off DC DOEE's website, and we have a couple printed copies in the booth as well, you're going to see a lot of maps like this. Thankfully, they all have legends at the bottom. But these were some of those vulnerability assessments that Amy touched on, where we overlaid the risks, the climate risks, with elements of the city that we knew might be most vulnerable to those risks. And out of those, 5 geographic areas in the city came to the top in terms of most vulnerable. And this is supplemented by specific vulnerable populations east of the river in Ward 7 and 8. The first one that the city started undertaking almost immediately was the flooding of the Watts Branch tributary. So this is a tributary that flows into the other rivers, which obviously then flows into the Chesapeake. This particular area came to light as a significant risk to a lot of vulnerable, what we would consider people in a vulnerable population. They were homeowners, many of them who were lower income. And in this particular neighborhood, these are homes that had been passed down from generation to generation. Consequently, there were no deeds, so the homeowners were having trouble getting flood insurance. And this is an area that is prone to flooding to the point where it has destroyed some homes. So the city has undertaken a downscaling study to figure out where exactly the floodings come from, why it's flooding, and what could be done to help mitigate for some of these homeowners. Buzzard Point is another area of development. This is probably the largest development that hadn't started yet when the plan was issued, but Audi Field, which is where the DC United plays, I don't know where the pointer is, I believe is right over here somewhere. I believe that's Nats Park. So this is a redevelopment of a quasi-industrial area. But when the city went about looking at the master plan of this, they were looking at making sure that there was a green infrastructure. I don't know if it doesn't really tell you, but that's the projected flooding of the neighborhood if nothing's done, based on current flood projections that were used for our downscaling. So the city undertook a system of green infrastructure where certain areas would act as buffers to the flood first and would be sacrificed so that we would be able to protect some of the buildings inboard of the green infrastructure. You can kind of see that starting to take shape on that plan. And then also using streets for vibrant public space, but also potentially for conduit for water if needed to keep it out of the residential portions of the development. And then this was already alluded to at the beginning of the morning, but these are pictures from last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago at most, this month. And it's a great reminder, it's a horrible reminder, but it's a great reminder of how natural disasters like this don't know boundaries. We talked a little bit this morning about social equity in the opening plenary. This is Canal Road in the district. This is one of the higher dollar areas to live in the district. You can kind of see that there was no way that they could prevent that just from the fact that that is a higher income location. But one of the factors that we looked at in the plan that you'll see in some of the community involvement actions is to make sure that the messaging goes to all different populations, because DC is a city of about 680,000, 700,000 people that swells to over 1 million every day and then contracts at night. We have commuters, we have visitors, we have tourists from other countries, we have places like the National Mall, which offer no shelter in the course of a shock. So making sure that the messaging that goes out from this plan is not just geared towards me, a resident, but also you, a tourist, or you, a commuter, or you, a visitor. We'll stop there.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anthony Flaccaveno. I have a small organic farm just outside of Abingdon. I've been doing community development work, what I now call bottom-up economics, for the last 30-plus years. And I'm going to kind of back us up a little bit to some maybe more basic questions, and then focus in a little on rural, and then finish up with a few slides that open the door to the rural-urban conversation. So first question is, what is resilience? And I'm sure people here are well versed in it. I'm going to talk about it from more of an economic standpoint than a kind of emergency preparedness. And I'm also excerpted from the Resilient Virginia vision statement. This is just a little piece of it, but I wanted to emphasize two things as a way to set up this kind of the differences between rural and urban. It says that Virginia communities will have gained the ability to better adapt to climate, environmental, social, and economic problems while remaining healthy, vibrant, and safe places. I put the emphasis in. And I guess that, for me, raised the question when I saw remaining immediately, that just so much of my world in Southwest Virginia and much of rural Virginia, it ain't about remaining healthy and vibrant at all. That's really not the issue. We're having a lot of problems. It's much more about achieving some greater degree of health, human health, economic health, vibrancy. That's the real challenge. And I would say that's true of many city neighborhoods as well, but for rural America and rural Virginia, it's pretty pervasive. I'd go further and say that actually the question of health and vibrancy is really an economic challenge. I don't know how many of you go back as far as I do, but over 50 years ago, Ivan Illich wrote a book called Toward a History of Needs. And that was a pretty good predictor of exactly the direction we've gone, of moving towards sort of a disempowering that so much of our technological development, so much of our economic development has, in many senses, as much as it's made life better and more convenient and blah, 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 it's also made us needier. We have higher levels of dependency, and with that vulnerability. Because ultimately, to adapt to the kind of crises that we're seeing more frequently and that we'll see with climate change and all the ancillary impacts of that, to be able to adapt, you have to have capacity. You've got to have the knowledge, you've got to have the skills, you've got to have the access to capital and local resources. You've got to be able to put it all together in one place the way Will Allen does in Milwaukee and Chicago, making formerly unproductive vacant areas highly productive. But that's what it's about in my mind. So how do we get to the point that we're kind of as sophisticated and advanced and rich as we are, that we're also at the same time perhaps more vulnerable, more dependent, more needy? So a few quick looks at the economy that's gotten us there and the economic theory. So this first graph is a look at how much the United States population grew over the last 37, 38 years, from 1980 on. From about 230 million to about 320 million. During exactly the same period of time, the size of the economy in the U.S. grew that much. Now look at that again. That's the population growth. This is the size of the economy adjusted for inflation over the same period. And what you see there is that although the population only grew by 40-some%, the economy grew almost threefold. So the big question is, why aren't we all much better off? Because we're not. Where did all that economic growth go? Because the economic growth, by Democrats and Republicans alike in different ways, is always touted as the solution to our problems. But in fact, we have grown a great deal, nearly tripled in size over the last generation and a half, and most of us are not better off. We're not wealthier. We have less wealth accumulated, all the more so for African American households. We have more tenuous jobs for the most part, and we certainly are not more resilient in our communities and neighborhoods. So that's one big problem, is the basic growth model. The other is that with that economic growth model comes a hyper obsession with the gross domestic product. And what that does as the measurement of wellness, because that's what we use it, again, Democrats and Republicans alike talking about economic growth as if it is the key to a healthy society, not just the economy. The problem is that these kinds of activities are better for the economy as we now measure it than that. So smoking and eating way too much is better for the economy than getting out and gardening and eating more modestly, as two examples. Why? Because when we smoke and buy that pack of cigarettes or two a day, we contribute just a tiny bit to the economy. When we get that 1 1/4 pound burger, we contribute a tiny bit to the economy. But when we get diabetes, when we get lung cancer, when we get emphysema, when we end up in chronic ill health, then we become spectacular contributors to the economy as we now measure it. This is the truth. This is not hyperbole. This is exactly the way we measure it. It's what many, many years ago Wendell Berry said, if you want to contribute more to the economy, get divorced. Because a broken household, and there's I'm divorced, lots of good reasons to end relationships. But his point was that a severed household contributed more to the economy than an intact household. So we've got this problem. We've got an economic system that makes us sick. As we talk about moving towards renewables, we can't forget the fact that not only have 70,000 coal miners died already, but we have an intense black lung epidemic in Southwest Virginia's coal fields, even as we have fewer and fewer miners. It's not only human health, it's ecological health, because in rural areas in particular, and I think this is probably true in semi-urban areas as well, ecological capital, like our very rich hardwood forests, is very often overused and yet undervalued. We cut the heck out of them, but then we send those valuable trees somewhere else where 90% or so of the economic value accrues. So we get the maximum damage and the minimum economic benefit. So how do we shift that around? How do we move towards an economy that would be one that would help cultivate resilience? So I'm going to suggest a few characteristics. One is, first, we need an economy that cultivates health. In southern West Virginia and in eastern Kentucky, they've started these pharmacy initiatives. Very simple idea, helping people eat better, but also creating more markets for farmers. So physicians and healthcare professionals are writing prescriptions for local produce, redeemable at local markets and farmers markets. Again, that's more market for farmers. That's people, often lower income clients, being helped to eat better. We need to build local capacity, whether it's the Grow Appalachia program in rural Southwest Virginia that reteaches people about gardening and nutrition and canning, or whether it's the kind of urban gardening that we see. In Detroit, there's over 1,800 community gardens. And again, not only are people gardening, but then local institutions are stepping in and raising the plants and the seeds. We need to focus on real local capital. Now, capital is defined in a lot of different ways, but we need, if we want real wealth, durable wealth, wealth that enables us to be resilient, we need real local capital. And one form of that, among others, is worker ownership. We don't have nearly enough of that in the United States. They have far more in Spain and northern Italy and some other places. It's a movement that's rekindled, and one of the best long-term examples in Appalachia comes from southeast Ohio with the Casa Nueva worker-owned restaurant co-op. Worker ownership is a big part of that wealth and resilience. Fundamentally, the most important capital that I'd say we have to preserve and restore is our soil. It's the foundation of health, not just in rural communities, but ultimately for the whole biosphere. That's the foundational capital. And lastly, I'd say that we need to move towards an economic system that overcomes estrangement, because that's what we have. And social media, for whatever benefits it has certainly helped to further the estrangement of us from our neighbors, from people who are different to us. And things like, I love to see in Amy and John's slides the idea of streets as a place of civic engagement. So too are farmers markets. We don't have the piazzas that they have in Italy and France and Spain, but we do have farmers markets and others that are not only a places to sell stuff, but where different kinds of people interact. And I've often said that on Saturday morning when the folks are lined up to buy our produce, I can look at them and I can see there's the Amy Goodman listener, there's the Glenn Beck supporter, there's the libertarian, and they're all together for a good purpose, which is to buy some healthy food from their neighbors. I'll close with this. If we're going to move towards an economy that's focused more on building health, building real capital, and building local capacity and overcoming estrangement, I think we also have to recognize that as urban and rural starts talking, we have a lot that we do together, but we have a lot of it that's kind of dysfunctional, what I'm calling hidden dependencies. And in the direction of rural to urban, they go in both directions. We have, for instance, the fact that, again, most of Virginia's open land is forested, much more so than strictly speaking, agricultural land. But what comes from those forests, primarily timber and things that we build with, but other products as well, is one of those interdependencies that in many respects is more like a hidden dependence. It's true of fiber and food as well. Now, the local food movement has helped to overcome some of that estrangement and to make those connections much better than they used to be. But for generations, and still it's all too normal, the people producing the food are disconnected from the people buying it and losing out economically while also perhaps not understanding fully the potential there. We have had a flow of energy from rural to urban, which has been primarily in Virginia in the form of coal and more recently gas. But now we have the potential for a lot of decentralized generation with solar panels in cities for sure, but also solar panels on old strip mines or open areas. And I was just in Manassas last night for a talk on the Green New Deal, and they have a large solar farm going up just outside of Manassas. So again, a flow of energy. And perhaps most of all is the potential that soil has not only to provide the nutrients for feeding us, but to sequester carbon. So absolutely critical to the climate change question. And yet, our economic strategies in rural and urban areas alone don't look at soil as the resource that it is. If land doesn't have buildings on it, it's considered undeveloped. And so the thing to do, the higher use, is to develop it, which means usually scraping away that topsoil and building something. Now, we've got to reverse that because we all ultimately rely on that carbon sequestration. Lastly, I'll say that in rural communities, when we start talking about these interdependencies, for those of us who are more in cities, let's remember that part of the disconnect, part of the anger that Jonna referred to, is that many people in rural areas, to be honest, farmers, foresters, loggers, fishermen, they all hate environmentalists. Not all, but a lot. And it's partly because the environment in the countryside is viewed more as part of livelihood. It's not something that we hold up as a great mystery. It's not something we just hike in. It's not somewhere we go for enlightenment. It's where we get our stuff. And it's a different view of the environment, and I think we have to recognize that. So as these hidden dependencies become mutual interdependencies, as Jonna was saying, I think we can see the flow of material from country to city, but also there's a tremendous need for knowledge, for people, and for money to flow back into the countryside. Ultimately, I think we can reduce these dependencies by making more economic connections much more directly between town and country. And that, I think, will be a basis for resilience in city and country alike. Thanks.
I will be the first to offer a reflection and just say those three presentations could not have been more different. And I don't mean that in a flippant way. I mean the starting point for those conversations about where action is, the types of strategies that are promoted, the types of activities that are being promoted to reach those outcomes are all quite different. I think at the beginning of this conversation, we can hardly see where those interdependencies or opportunities to capitalize on interdependencies really lie. And we see them sort of in a nascent state, right? We see them that they're sort of there if we can figure out how to capitalize on them. But there's still this sort of underlying theme here, which is why do we want to be more interdependent? Obviously, as Anthony suggested, people in rural areas sometimes are aggrieved by the way that they're viewed by people in urban areas. There's not necessarily a trust that the urbanites have rural people and their best interests in mind when they're voting, when they're consuming products. And likewise, I think there's sort of a cultural difference that that comes from the urbanites and how we think about where we get our stuff, whether it's cheap, whether we got a good deal, whether or not the people that are growing or producing the raw products that we rely on for those consumables are smart enough to make good choices about the quality of those resources. We see it kind of played out on the TV sometimes. So whether or not we want to be more independent, I think maybe is a starting point for this conversation. Now that I've said my piece, I'll turn it back to you all to reflect on each other's presentations and offer any insights that you kind of glean from listening to each other. Please. Might be on. Might have to click the button there.
Okay. Is it on? Can you? Okay.
There you go.
Well, I don't think that we have a choice about being interdependent or not. I think we are. I think that sometimes we pretend that we're not, and you kind of create that divide. But I mean, I think if you live in a city, you probably get immense resources from rural. You just don't maybe take the time to find out where it's coming from, the way that perhaps somebody who is actually in a rural area that maybe knows their neighbor who is creating the other thing. So I don't think that we have a choice about being dependent. And like John was talking about, what, you know, especially with weather, weather doesn't care where you live and what your address is and, you know, what your zip code is. I mean, in DC, we were sort of laughing that, you know, you have that outline of DC in our report, and we weren't allowed to think about Maryland or Virginia, but quite frankly, when the water comes from Maryland, it rolls through DC and goes to the Potomac, and there's no two ways about that, and the water doesn't care. So I do think that we're all, and you know, there's rural farmland in Maryland, and everything just runs down. So I think we are dependent whether we like it or not. So we don't have a choice. So.
I would also say, you know, in the resilient design world, there's this concept of scale jumping and systems thinking. And when we talk about designing a building that's resilient, I mean, conceptually, if you've got a building and you put a seawall around it to block out the flood, you've made a really resilient building, but you're a really crappy neighbor because you've pushed all of your water now to your neighbors. You've also isolated yourself. You can't communicate well with your neighbors. So to be truly resilient, we have to design in terms of systems, and those systems may be as small as a city block, or it may be as big as a state. And that's where you get that sort of interdependence that we and we representing the city here can't push our water onto the rural areas the same way that the rural areas can't push their water onto the urban areas. We have to figure out together what to do with the water.
So isn't that kind of baked into environmental statutes as they currently exist? I mean, there are certain provisions about stormwater management and urban design as it's practiced under the law that kind of take up that slack. I mean, procedurally, you have to account for where water is coming from and going to. So aren't we as interdependent as we could be?
I would say in some ways, yes, but I'm speaking from the Washington, D.C. vantage point with our zoning code. We are supposed to be treating a certain amount of water on site before it leaves our site. We have the green area ratio that talks about that, but there's still opportunities to do all the right things on your site, and purposely or accidentally, it negatively impacts those around you. So even if you are meeting the code minimums, which is what a lot of people go by, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the right solution to the problem.
I'll just say that, as I glanced at a little bit of your plan before coming here and then saw some more slides today. And, again, what I'm certainly not trying to convey is that we've got it all figured out in the countryside and you all owe us, because we sure don't. And one of the big issues, one of the big ironies in rural America now is that rates of diabetes and obesity and other health-related things are higher in most of our small towns and rural areas. And part of it is because lifestyle has changed so dramatically. So a couple of generations ago, you could eat high on the hog, but you burned it all off, and most rural folks aren't burning it off at the same rate. And so part of what we're looking for, and part of what some of the more progressive local community development people in small towns are doing now, is looking at some of the smart growth, looking at the walkability, bikeability, all of that stuff started more in cities, trying to figure out how to make that work in places like St. Paul and Coburn and Lebanon and Abingdon and that sort of thing. So I think there's a definite mutual learning here. I mean, part of my belief is that the best way we can be mutually interdependent in a way that's synergistic and not sort of parasitic is by being as self-reliant as we can ourselves. I mean, I think that begins in the household. I think there's just too many households that are now places of consumption and don't do a whole lot of productive activities. And if you think of it from the household as being a small economy to the neighborhood, to the community, to the town, to the region, to the degree that we're more self-reliant, have more capacity, it opens the door for the interrelationships with other places further away to be a healthy one. If rural areas totally depend on you for the capital to come in and the people to come and buy our stuff, that's not healthy, just as you totally depending on us for food and energy is not healthy. So I think we need that level of self-reliance.
I had two thoughts on that as well. One was just looking at what you're doing in D.C. It reminds me a little bit of what you see in other parts of Virginia. I believe it was in Dickinson County, all their schools are built in a floodplain, and they're looking to relocate them. And you go throughout Virginia, so much of our towns were built either along rivers or along railroad tracks, which were built along rivers. They're all prone to flooding as well. And there's lessons to be learned probably either way. The case of Grundy, that might be a lesson, maybe not what not to do, but it can go both ways. And the other thing, I see this a lot with demographic data, is that it's amazing how much of the labor force in urban areas comes from rural areas, younger people going for their first job, for education to start their career. And then in rural areas, how much of their older population are people moving out of urban areas? Some of them maybe grew up there. A lot of them just want to move out there because they want something else, and they want to become part of that community. So you definitely see a flow of population between the two, and there definitely is a sort of interdependence, at least demographically.
There's also the overlap, I think, that urban and rural areas share with respect to how climate change is impacting health. And you brought up in particular the rate of diabetes. When we were doing our vulnerability assessment for Washington, D.C., overlaying the vulnerable populations with the climate risks, some of the most critical care facilities we found were dialysis clinics. Not the actual hospitals, but the local in-neighborhood dialysis clinics. And if they go down, they impact more people in the city than if the hospital actually goes down. So, and just with, as a corollary, the New York Times just had an article a couple days ago about how with this more increased, the new normal that we were talking about earlier of flooding, that waterborne illnesses are on the rise, and how for every day that the floodwaters don't recede, how much exponentially there's a greater risk of certain types of diseases and pathogens. Like these are types of problems that impact no matter where you live. And I think these are the types of things, especially when they relate to human health, that rural and urban could come together to figure out solutions, because there may be times where we're going to have to rely on each other in one way, shape, or form to combat those.
And the interdependent corollary to that is when a hog lagoon from a massive hog CAFO in North Carolina floods, the tremendous health consequences for people, miles, they're ongoing, but miles, and that problem is directly traceable to a big demand for cheap sausage. So again, that's where we can see the problem. Then we need to unravel it and figure out if that's such a bad thing, maybe we should be supporting a different model of animal production.
I'll kind of pursue that a little bit, because at least, Anthony, in your presentation, you did use the word hidden, and then just now you sort of suggested that there was an unraveling that we needed to do, sort of parsing out these ideas of interdependence. I think that's very compelling. I think there's a lot of interest in doing that. What my concern is that we don't have the tools available to us. We don't have the forum in which to explore those things. There seems to be sort of an occasional experience to that, where it's not a sort of a concerted effort to explore those things. And John, you kind of, or actually it was Amy that kind of pointed out that the water does come from Maryland and flow through D.C., but unless you're working on that project, it's not something that you would have surfaced. It was a hidden interdependency. And so You may see a sign on the side of the highway that says you're leaving the Chesapeake Bay, but that is a far cry from having a tool as part of a local planning exercise that helps you understand sort of the externalities of not thinking about those interdependencies. So I guess my question is, are there tools that you have used to be able to surface these hidden interdependencies, and how much more work would it be if you did sort of internalize those externalities?
Well, I mean, I'm just one little guy from Southwest Virginia, but this is what I write about and talk about all the time. And I think the most effective way to do it is to begin to create the alternatives that we want and then let them exemplify something better. So again, just going back to the local food movement as an example, when you create the connection between city and country by creating a farmer's market that's a vibrant market that builds, that incubates other businesses, and people begin to, at all income levels, I would say, at least in Southwest Virginia, people begin to realize what's good about that in the process of becoming people with good habits, supporting local farmers, eating better. You can then also begin to more effectively educate folks about how bad the alternative is. If you just preach at people, I just read The Meat Racket a few months ago, and if you just preach about how bad Tyson Foods is because of what they do to contract farmers, not to mention the environment and chickens, well, people are like, oh, leave me alone, I'm struggling, don't make me feel guilty. But if you create an alternative where people are buying some of their meats from a local farmer that's not using those practices, and then through book groups, through seminars, through other things, you begin to show people some of the downside of the sort of current system, the conventional system, I think you can receive that critique much more when you feel like you're part of the solution. So one of my kind of tools is always trying to find a way to help people, whether it's in food, whether it's in energy, fiber, whatever it is, helping people participate in the emerging alternative that is more to their values as a way to open their minds also. That seems to work.
I'm also going to say it's having the right people with fresh perspectives at the table. Like sometimes it's not just the status quo to answer the question, and that pharmacy is a great example. That could have easily just been a program of local government. It could have been a farmer's co-op, but the addition of medical personnel, if they were truly physically writing prescriptions, like it adds a level of legitimacy and a different group of people thinking about the same problem to arrive at the same answer. Amy and I worked on a sustainability and resilience master plan for a local hospital complex in Northern Virginia a few years ago. And we were sitting there and, for a typical planning session for a new hospital or for a master plan, you might have the director of facilities and the head doctor or the head nurse. But we also invited some of the building engineers, and I think there was like the director of human resources and people who you might not see at that table. Well, there came a time where we were talking about a problem that they had been having. We were talking about ways for them to increase their water supply in the event of a natural disaster, the water that they needed to keep on hand. And finally, one of the building engineers who manages the parking garages said, yeah, and if there was only a way we could figure out what to do with that underground spring we keep having to pump out at the bottom of at the bottom of garage B for the past 3.5 years. They had never talked to each other, but we found the solution. Sometimes you have to bring different people to the table who are affected by the same problem to get a different answer.
I think the food, fresh food and vegetables is also a great example of interdependencies and bringing different voices to the table. We've had neighborhoods in DC that were food deserts for generations, and then you have a grocery store that comes in and the grocery store fails because no one is buying the produce and they can't figure out why, and then you have someone go into the neighborhood and talk to people, and you literally have people who don't know how to cook fresh vegetables because they have spent their whole life in a food desert and haven't been taught. You forget that dependency on canned vegetables or buying your already prepared food, and you don't realize that literally people have a knowledge gap of even how to cook foods, and then it's incredibly intimidating when you are faced with a food market or you are faced with fresh food, but the person who built the grocery store, it never occurred to them that someone wouldn't know what to do with their food. So if you would have had maybe a neighborhood coalition come in when you built the, finally brought the fresh produce in to say, hey, let's have some cooking classes. Let's help people be less intimidated. And I think that helps with some issues that a lot of places have with people just being unhealthy because they don't know what to do with it. So.
Well, we have a few minutes left. We do have a couple of microphones that are available for you all. I would just be curious to hear if there's some thoughts or some questions that have been sponsored by this conversation. There's a woman here in the middle.
Hi, Janine Fennell with Leaders in Energy, and I had a question for Anthony. Anthony, you got my attention about the land where you said it really doesn't have value unless it's being built. And I just get so concerned. I see it all the time, the urban sprawl, You go out to Leesburg and all these houses are pushing up like mushrooms on former farmland. It's all over the place. You go out to Denver. I mean, it's just incredible. So I guess I wanted to ask you is, do you think there's a way in the future for additional income and farm stability through carbon offsets as a way to help protect land? Mitigate our carbon, climate change issue, and just help provide more income and value for farmers to maybe preserve some of this land. And heck, we can even use it in our cities because I know we get so much infill in Arlington. Well, to cut down trees and build more housing communities and everything too. It's a tough issue. And anyhow, thank you so much for all the issues that you were raising.
No, I think that's great. Actually, I'm involved with the Virginia Green New Deal, which is trying to build out a platform for it. I think there's a session about it later today. And one of the things that we're working on is exactly that, is figuring out a system, and some states have already enacted it, to pay farmers for ecosystem services, most fundamentally carbon. Because many people know this, but some people don't, that the climate change problem comes from having too much carbon up there. But what a lot of folks don't know is we've given up between 50 and 70% of our soil carbon over the last 60, 70 years. We've just given it up. And soil carbon is the basis of organic matter, and organic matter is the foundation of a healthy soil, whether you're growing trees on it, grass, or tomatoes. And so I think there's two pieces that would, over time, three pieces that would help with the sprawl question. One is simply pushing, not just in cities, but in small towns, for compact development, for smart growth, for the livability, for the interface stuff, because the sprawl model is just, kind of uniquely American and it's destructive. So that's critical. The second thing is we have to make working lands profitable, whether it's a pasture-based ranch, whether it's a crop production, or whether it's a piece of forest land. Whoever is managing that has to be able to make some money on it, because the reason so many farmers want to sell out is because you can't make any money farming, and you can sure make some money selling it off to somebody who's going to build on it. So we've got to make farming and forestry and fisheries much more economical. And then the third thing is a piece of that, besides paying more for the products and giving farmers a larger share of the food dollar, is paying for these invaluable ecosystem services. The estimates vary widely, but somewhere between, at the low end, 15%, and at the high end, 50, 60% of all of our emission excess could be sequestered in soil as soil carbon if we just really focused on that. So that's a public good for people in cities and country alike, to pay farmers to do the right thing, to pay foresters to do the right thing.
So if anyone doing that here in the U.S., I think France has 4 parts per 1,000 to try to help farmers in terms of increasing carbon in the soil. And I don't think that's know about that. But in terms of ecosystem services, is anyone really doing it here?
Well, as I've been looking into this, there are some state laws that are either being considered, or a couple that have passed, including in Maryland, that are taking baby steps towards that, including things like having lists of carbon-friendly practices, things that sequester, and then putting a per-acre value on that. Now, that has problems of its own, because if you've got a 2,000-acre ranch and you're getting paid $20 an acre to use the right grazing practices, that's significant. If you've got a 10-acre vegetable farm, 20 acres ain't worth the bother. I mean, $20 an acre ain't worth the bother. But we've got to figure those things out. But yes, people are working on specific legislation that identifies carbon sequestering practices, and then trying to put a monetary figure on that.
Okay. We've got a question down here.
Sure. So, it's actually a two-part question. I think the first part of it is for you, sir, Mr. Anthony, I think. I can't see from this angle. The engineer next to you, she mentioned the term food deserts. My question first to you is, are you familiar with those? And maybe before that you answer that, would you be so kind, ma'am, to give us an explanation of what that term food desert is? Because if you're not in an urban environment, you may not understand what that means for the community.
Oh, okay. I mean, a food desert is simply a neighborhood's, usually a large swath of a part of a city or a neighborhood that doesn't have access to fresh food, like any kind of grocery store or anything like that.
So the only produce that they would have access to would probably be in 7-Eleven.
I was going to say the 7-Eleven, yeah.
Okay, so, Mr. Anthony, are you familiar with that? Have you taken steps to try to bridge that gap, or did you leave that to whole food?
I love it. That's a great...
Bezos problem now.
He's trying to provoke me. I love it. No, I'm quite familiar with it. Actually, the whole progression of the kind of sustainable farming, local food movement over the last maybe 30-ish years started out focused totally on farmers and getting farmers more money for what they're producing, particularly if they were using organic and sustainable practices. Over the last decade and a half, there's been a come to Jesus about, this is great, farmers are doing a little bit better, at least some. People are willing to pay a little more, but we're leaving out whole swaths of the population, including people in food deserts. And there are, by the way, food deserts in rural communities as well. They're just a little less commonly known about. But so there's a few interesting tools that are trying to tackle that. Number one is that about 10 years ago, USDA allowed EBT cards, SNAP benefits to be redeemable at a farmer's market. And in most farmers markets in Virginia now, including in little towns like Abingdon, as well as big cities like Richmond, people can go to the farmers market, they can use their SNAP card, and most farmers markets double the value. So if you swipe $10 on your card, you actually get $20 to spend on healthy food there. So that's been a really important way to grapple with it. The second is a little more complex. I just finished a project with some folks in Minneapolis, one of several mobile markets where people are taking old RVs or school buses in this case, converting them into basically a mobile grocery store, stocking them full of produce, dairy, healthy meats, maybe a little bit of processed foods, and going to the low-income neighborhoods, whether it's a subsidized housing or just a community that doesn't have a grocery store. So they're taking the grocery to them like one day a week. It's a tough model to make work from a business point of view. It's a very expensive way to get food to people. But many mobile markets, including in D.C., there's one called the Arcadia Market, are certainly finding willing customers, people who are coming out, buying the produce and other healthy food. So yes, we're beginning to tackle that question. It's a tough one, but we're working on it.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. We've had a break until 2:30, but I would like to offer a round of applause for our panelists. We really appreciate it.